Some betrayals arrive as a whisper in the dark. The cruelest come dressed in white lace, in front of 300 smiling guests, at the exact moment you are meant to be happiest. When Bryony Merivale stood at the altar and watched her own sister take her place beside the groom, she did not weep, she did not scream. She simply understood that someone had planned this down to the very minute. By the time the sun went down that evening, she would be married to the one man in all of England the world believed to be a murderer, and she would go willingly. The bells of St. Wyston's had rung since dawn, and Bryony Merivale had smiled through every peal of them. She stood at the head of the long aisle, her gloved hand resting on the cold stone of the chancel rail, and she told herself that the tremor in her fingers was only the January air. Frost had feathered the tall windows into white ferns. The candles bent and guttered in the draught from the great door. 300 guests filled the pews in their furs and their borrowed finery, and not one of them had come for love of her. They had come for the spectacle. A Merivale wedding was the last fine thing a fading family could offer, and all of the county wished to see it spent. Across the chancel stood Osric Vane. He was handsome in the shallow way of a man who has never once been refused, and his wedding coat was new, and his boots were new, and his smile, when he turned it upon her, did not reach his restless eyes. Bryony had known for a month that he did not love her, and she had made her peace with it. A marriage was a contract, and she had signed a great many contracts in her time, balancing the accounts her aunt would not touch, mixing the tinctures that kept the village from calling the surgeon. She had believed she understood the terms of this one. She was wrong. The vicar cleared his throat and opened his book. "Dearly beloved," he read, and his voice rolled out over the hushed church. "We are gathered here." And it was precisely then, on the word gathered, not a breath sooner, that her aunt rose from the front pew. Lady Drusilla Merivale stood in plum silk and cold diamonds, and she lifted one hand to her heart as though something there had wounded her. In the other hand, she held a letter, a single folded sheet, its seal already broken. "I cannot," she said, and her voice carried to the last row with the ease of long practice. "I cannot let this proceed. God forgive me. I have only now discovered what she is." A murmur moved through the pews like wind through wheat. Bryony did not move. She watched her aunt cross to the vicar and press the letter into his startled hands, and she watched the old man's eyes travel down the page and widen, and she understood, with the cold, clean clarity that had always been her particular curse, that she was looking at a performance. The letter was too conveniently at hand. The break in the seal was too old. Drusilla had not just discovered anything. She had rehearsed this grief before a mirror. The vicar looked up. "Is this—" he began, and could not finish. It was read aloud, of course. It always is. A letter in a hand that was not Bryony's, addressed to a lover she had never met, thick with words she had never written. The church drank it in. Somewhere behind her, a woman laughed and disguised it as a cough. Osric Vane took one careful step back from her, his face arranged into a mask of noble injury, and Bryony saw that he had known. His step was too smooth. He had practiced it. "I could not in conscience take her now," Osric said to the vicar, loud enough for the furthest pew. "A gentleman has his honor." And then the last piece fell, and it fell so neatly that Bryony almost admired it. From the side aisle, veiled and pale and gowned in white, came her sister. Cressida walked to the altar as though she had walked it 100 times because she had. Bryony saw everything in the space of a single held breath. She saw that Cressida's gown had been let out at the shoulder and taken in at the waist, altered over weeks, to fit a second bride. She saw the ring already waiting in the vicar's tray-sized, small-sized for her sister's slender hand, and not her own. She saw a second marriage license, lying folded beneath the register, its ink long dry. None of this had been decided in the last 5 minutes. All of it had been decided in some quiet room, on some ordinary afternoon, while Bryony sat below stairs, measuring out chamomile, and believing herself safe. The whole of it, the letter and the groom and the sister and the ring and the license, had been built like a clock. Every gear had been set to turn on this one morning, at this one word. Cressida would not look at her. That was the only mercy in it. Her sister kept her veiled face turned to the flagstones, and her hands shook, and Bryony felt, beneath the ice that was closing over her, one small and unwelcome flicker of pity. She could have wept. The church was waiting for her to weep. She could have screamed her innocence, could have torn the false letter from the vicar's hands, could have named her aunt a liar before God and the whole county. That was the part written for her. That was the spectacle they had gathered to see. Bryony Merivale straightened her spine. She let go of the chancel rail. She looked at her aunt and at the groom who had never been hers, and at the sister who could not meet her eyes, and she said nothing at all. She turned, and with 300 faces watching, and the frost still whitening the glass, she walked back down the long aisle alone, her steps even, her chin level, and she gave them not one tear to carry home. It was only at the very back of the church, in the shadow of the last pillar, that she saw the man in the gray coat. He was not weeping and he was not laughing. He stood entirely still while the whole church seethed around him, and he watched her the way she watched a fever, as though he were quietly counting something. When her eyes met his, he did not look away. He inclined his head, the smallest fraction, as though something had just been confirmed. Then Bryony stepped out into the white glare of the morning, and behind her the great door swung shut upon the sound of her sister's wedding. The Merivale carriage carried 3 people home from the church that morning, and Bryony was not one of them. So she walked. It was 4 miles along the frozen turnpike from St. Wyston's to the house her father had left her, and no one had troubled to leave her a horse. The cold came up through the thin soles of her wedding slippers, and settled deep in the bones of her feet, and she found that she was almost glad of it. Pain was clarifying. Pain kept a woman from doing something foolish, such as sinking into a hedgerow to weep where the whole county might pass and see. She did not weep. She walked, and she thought, and by the 3rd mile, she had assembled all of it in her mind the way she assembled a remedy, each bitter part measured into its place. Her father had died when she was 19 and had left her a portion. Not a grand one, but enough. Enough for a woman to marry upon, or, should she never marry, enough to live upon quietly once she came of age at 25. Until that birthday, the money sat under the hand of her guardian, under the hand of Drusilla. Bryony was 3 months short of 25. There it was. The shape of the thing cold and complete. Had she married Osric Vane that morning, her portion would have passed from her aunt's keeping into her husband's, and Drusilla would have lost it. Had she merely reached her birthday unwed, the money would have come to Bryony herself, and Drusilla would have lost it just the same. But a disgraced woman, a woman shamed before God and the county, a woman no one would receive and no court would favor, such a woman could be kept. Kept quiet, kept dependent, kept forever just short of the freedom her father had bought for her, and her portion would stay exactly where it sat. Cressida had only ever been the polish on the scheme. Marry the younger sister to Osric Vane, and the alliance the family wanted was secured, the settlement kept in friendly hands, and the elder sister erased in the very same stroke. It was, Bryony thought. She might have admired it in a stranger. The house was cold when she reached it. No fire had been lit in her room. Her trunk stood already packed and corded in the hall, and Drusilla stood beside it, still in her plum silk, warming her diamonds at the one fire that had been permitted to burn. "You walked," her aunt observed. "How very like you." She did not wait for a reply. "You have 3 days to remove yourself to the cottage at Marsh End. It is small, but a ruined woman needs little. You shall have £30 a year and the quiet you have always claimed to prefer. You will not write to your sister. You will not come to this house. And you will be in time very grateful that I did not simply turn you out into the road." Bryony set nothing down, because she carried nothing. She looked at her aunt across the small and triumphant fire. "You forged a letter," she said. Her voice did not shake. "You dressed my sister in a gown you had been altering for weeks. You had a second license drawn, and a ring cut small, and you timed all of it to the word 'gathered,' so that no man in that church could ever swear I had merely been jilted. You did all of this, aunt, for 3 months and a portion my own father meant for me." She tilted her head. "I only wish to be certain I have the sum of it correct. You have ruined me entirely, before everyone I have ever known. For money, you would have been made to surrender before the first cuckoo of the spring." For one instant, something flickered behind Drusilla's diamonds. Bryony did not flatter herself that it was shame. It was the small, sour displeasure of a clever woman who does not enjoy being read aloud. "Go and wait for the cart," Drusilla said. "You leave within the hour." Bryony went. She did not go to wait for the cart. She went out through the kitchen garden instead, past the dead beds where her physic herbs stood black and frostbitten, and she stopped at the low wall at the end of it, because a man was standing on the other side of that wall who had no business being there at all. He wore a gray coat. She knew him at once. He was the man who had stood at the back of the church and watched her walk out of it, counting something behind his eyes, and he was watching her now with that same still and unsettling attention. "Miss Merivale," he said, and he bowed as though she were still a woman of consequence. "My name is Crane. I have the honor to serve His Grace the Duke of Blackmere." The name dropped into the frozen garden like a stone let fall down a well. Every soul in England knew that name, and knew the tale fastened to it. The Duke of Blackmere. The man who had buried a young wife 2 winters past, who had never once been charged and never once been believed innocent. "His Grace," said Crane, "requests the honor of your company today, before the sun is down." She could have refused a summons from a man the world called a murderer, delivered over a garden wall on the worst morning of her life. Was not an invitation a sensible woman accepted? But refusing meant Marsh End, and £30 a year, and Drusilla's hand resting slow and heavy upon her for the rest of her days. And beneath the ice that had closed over her at the altar, Bryony found one small ember still burning. It was not fear, it was curiosity. So she gathered her cloak, stepped over the low wall, and went. Crane's carriage was black and well sprung and blessedly warm, and it carried her east, toward the sea Bryony had expected to be afraid. Instead, she sat in a clear gray calm, watching the frost-bound country slide past the glass, thinking that a woman who has already lost everything before noon has very little left to dread by afternoon. The hedgerows gave way to low stone walls, and the walls to open moor, and at last where the moor broke off against a sky, the color of a whetted knife, she saw the sea. Above it, upon a black shoulder of rock, stood Blackmere. It was not a house that wished to be liked. It was old and dark and scoured by salt, its windows narrow, its roofline broken by a single square tower that stood against the gray like a raised fist. The gardens below its walls were themselves walled, and one of them, she saw as they drew near, was a great structure of glass, its many panes clouded and blind, a conservatory gone dim and lifeless in the cold. They believe it looks like a house a murderer would keep, she thought, and she could not, in honesty, disagree. The carriage stopped before a low door studded with iron, and it was opened before she reached it by a tall old man with a face like a folded map. He did not glance at her muddied hem or her ruined wedding slippers with any surprise at all. He had plainly been told exactly what to expect. "Your Grace will forgive the cold," he said. "We do not warm the west rooms. This way, if you please, Your Grace." The words were absurd upon her, but the old man said them without the faintest flicker, and led her through halls, where every mirror was hung with black crepe, and every clock stood stopped at some forgotten hour, into a long dark room, where a fire burned low, and where a man stood at the far window with his back to her, looking out at the failing light upon the water. "Miss Merivale, Your Grace," said the old man, and withdrew and shut the door. For a long moment the man at the window did not turn. Bryony used the moment as she used every moment given her. She observed. He was tall, taller than Osric had been, and built along the lines of a man who had once been strong, but the coat hung loose from his shoulders now, as though it had been cut for a larger man or for the same man in a kinder year. His dark hair had gone gray at the temples, though she judged him no more than 35. And when at last he turned, she saw a face that had once been handsome, and was now merely severe, the cheeks hollowed, the skin drawn and grayish in the low firelight, the dark eyes ringed and overbright. She had come expecting a brute. She found instead a man who looked very much like his own ghost. "So," said the Duke of Blackmere, his voice was low and even, and offered nothing. "You are the disgraced Miss Merivale." "I am," said Bryony. "And you are the wicked Duke who murdered his wife." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. "We are each, it seems, precisely as advertised." He gestured toward a chair and did not sit himself. "I will not waste your afternoon, madam. You have had a great deal taken from you today already, without my adding tedium to the reckoning." She did not sit either. She was watching his hand. He had laid it upon the back of the chair as he gestured, and she had seen the fine tremor in it before he stilled it, and she had marked the way he had crossed the room a moment before, careful and measured, a man counting out his strength as though it were coin he could not spare. "You are unwell," she said before she had quite decided to say it. The Duke went very still. "I beg your pardon. Forgive me." But she did not stop, because 10 years of the still room had trained her eye, and it went now where it always went. "Your color is bad. Not the high flush of fever, but the gray of something underneath. You favor your side. You cross that floor as though you did not entirely trust it. Your physicians will have called it grief, or a weak heart, or a melancholy of the blood, and I dare say they have bled you for it, which will have done nothing but make you weaker." She stopped herself. "I am sorry, I forget my place. It is a habit no one has ever managed to marry out of me." The Duke of Blackmere looked at her then in an entirely new way. The cold assessment was gone from his face, and in its place was something sharper and far more startled, as though a chair had spoken or a stone in the wall. "How very curious," he said softly. "I sent for a woman who required rescuing. Crane assured me you were desperate, discreet and clever in a household. He neglected to mention you were an apothecary." "He did not ask," said Bryony. "No one ever does." The last of the light lay red along the sea. Somewhere in the great silent house, a single clock ticked on, the only one left running. The Duke crossed to a small table, poured nothing, touched nothing, and turned to face her whole. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Merivale, and very little of the day left in which to make it. So I shall be plain. I require a wife. I require her at once. I require her before that sun has finished going down." He watched her face, found no swoon in it, and seemed the better pleased for that. "You have until sunset to accept." "Before sunset," Bryony repeated. "You find the whole of it uncivil." "I was all ready to be married once today, Your Grace. It went rather poorly." That earned her the nearest thing to a laugh she had yet drawn from him, a short, dry sound, gone almost before it came. He lowered himself at last into the chair across from her, and she saw again the great care with which he did it, and she filed the observation away with all the others she was quietly gathering. "Then you will wish to know what it is you are agreeing to. That is more than most brides are ever granted." He set his ruined hands flat upon his knees, as if to keep them from betraying him. "I am dying, Miss Merivale. My physicians disagree only upon the speed of the thing, and when I am gone, if I have neither wife nor child, then everything I hold passes whole and unencumbered to my cousin, Blackmere the lands. The 4 villages that live and die by it, and the people in them who have worked this rock for 300 years, all of it, at a stroke, to my cousin Lysander fell, and you do not wish it to. I would sooner give it to the sea." He said it without heat, which somehow made it worse. A wife alters the arithmetic. A duchess holds a jointure that the law itself will rise to defend. A duchess may keep and hold a house that a dead man can no longer protect. And a duchess who is loyal to me and not to him might yet stand between my cousin and everything I have spent my life trying to hold together. He looked at her steadily. "I cannot offer you love in return for your name. I have none to spare, and even less time, so I offer you a contract instead. Protection, independence, a settlement that is yours alone, and forever beyond your aunt's reach, and a title, which, whatever else it may be, is a wall no Drusilla Merivale will ever climb." Bryony was silent for a moment. The clock ticked. Beyond the window the sea went from pewter to iron, and the red bled slowly out of the sky. "You have told me a great deal about what I stand to gain," she said. "You have not once asked me what I require." "Then tell me what you require." She had not, in truth, planned to bargain. She discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she fully intended to. "I will have my own rooms and my own hours, and no man, husband or otherwise, shall enter the one without knocking, nor command the other at all. I will have a still room of my own, and the freedom to use it as I please. I will not be a duchess in the drawing-room, and a servant in every room beyond it. And I will have the settlement drawn, so that it holds fast, whether I please you or whether I do not. I have spent 6 years dependent upon the goodwill of a clever and a cruel person, Your Grace. I will not trade one such keeper for another, however fine the house he keeps me in." The Duke of Blackmere studied her for a long, unhurried moment. Then he inclined his head, exactly as Crane had done at the back of the church that morning, the smallest possible fraction, as though something had once again been confirmed for him. "Agreed," he said, "all of it, as you have said it. Greaves will bring the papers." The papers came, and were read, and Bryony read, every line of them twice, which appeared to please him more than gratitude would have. The special license lay among them. Procured, she now understood before ever she had walked out of St. Wyston's that morning, he had been very sure of her, or else he had been very desperate. She was already learning that, in this house, the two were frequently the same thing. There was an hour yet before the light would fail, and Mrs. Tolliver came for her. The housekeeper said very little. She led Bryony up a cold and winding stair to a small room that smelled of dust and dried lavender, and there she drew out, from a press that had plainly not been opened in years, a gown of deep gray silk, plain and very fine. It was not a bride's white. Bryony was glad past speaking of that. She had worn white that morning and been made a fool in front of the whole county in it, and she did not think she could ever bear to see the color against her skin again. Mrs. Tolliver dressed her in silence, her work-worn hands quick and gentle at the lacings. Only once did she pause. She stood behind Bryony at the clouded looking-glass, gazing at their two reflections, and something crossed the old woman's face that Bryony could not read. "You have kind eyes," she said at last, low, almost to herself. She had kind eyes, too, and she would not say who she meant, though Bryony, who was already learning the shape of this house, could very well guess. Bryony looked at herself in the dim mirror, a ruined woman that morning. A duchess by dark, she had not chosen the man, but she had chosen every last line of the terms, and there was a strange, cold power in it she had never once tasted before. For 6 long years her fate had been handed to her by another hand. Tonight, for the first time, she had reached out and bargained for it herself. They were married in the private chapel at Blackmere. As the very last of the light went out of the sky, it was nothing whatever like the morning. There were no 300 guests in furs come to watch a woman fall. There was only Greaves, upright and grave, beside the door. There was Mrs. Tolliver, her hands folded and her eyes unaccountably wet. And there was a frightened young curate, fetched up from the village, who kept glancing at the Duke as though he half expected to be struck dead for his trouble. The chapel was very old and very plain, its walls bare stone, its only ornament the great west window, through which the dying day now poured red and gold across the worn flagstones. Bryony stood in the warm color of it, and felt it upon her cold face, and thought that she had never in her life been married by such a light. Candles burned against the deep cold, and their breath showed white upon the air. And by that dying light, Bryony Merivale, who had been disgraced and penniless before noon, became the Duchess of Blackmere before the dark. The Duke's hands were cold when he took her own. She could feel the tremor in them plainly, now a fine and constant thing, and when the curate came to the binding words, she saw the gray deepen suddenly in his face. She saw him sway, the smallest degree, a tall tree taking the first breath of a coming wind. Without stopping to think, she tightened her grip upon his hands and slid her other hand quietly beneath his elbow, low and unseen between them, and there she held him upright, while he made his vows in a voice that was steady and level, and cost him more than any soul in that chapel could have guessed. He looked down, once, at her hand upon his arm. He said nothing at all, but something moved behind the overbright eyes, surprise again, and beneath the surprise, so brief that she might almost have dreamed it, something that was very nearly grief. The ring he set upon her finger was old and heavy, and worn thin with the passage of other lives. And at the very back of the chapel, half sunk in the shadow of a pillar, a fair-haired young man in an immaculate coat watched it all, with a smile fixed carefully upon his handsome face. He clapped, once very softly when it was done, and murmured his warm congratulations to the room. But Bryony had spent her whole life watching people, and she watched him now, and she saw that the smile never once reached his eyes. She saw that the clapping hands were white at the knuckle. She saw that Lysander Fell, who not 1 hour before had been the heir to all of it, was gazing at the plain old ring upon her finger as though it were a blade that had just been slid slow and certain between his ribs. Whatever else this cold and hasty marriage was, she understood in that moment that it had made her, from this evening forward, something she had never before been. It had made her an obstacle. And obstacles, in houses such as this one, had a way of being quietly removed. They did not speak of love, and they did not trouble to pretend to. On her first night as a duchess, Bryony slept alone in a great cold chamber in the east wing, in a bed that had been aired but never warmed, and she lay awake a long while listening to the sea worry at the rocks below, and thinking that she had exchanged one strange house for another before a single day was out. But this house was strange in ways the old one had never been. Over the days that followed, Bryony learned its rules the way she learned all things, quietly and by watching. She learned that the clocks throughout the house had been stopped 2 winters past, on the very night the first Duchess died, and never wound again since. All but the one in the Duke's study, which he kept running with his own hand, as though to prove to the house that he at least had not stopped with them. She learned that the mirrors were draped not for any fashion of mourning, but because the Duke could no longer bear to meet his own reflection. She learned that an entire wing of Blackmere stood shut and cold and forbidden, and that the maids crossed themselves when their work took them past its door. And she learned the dead woman's name. It was Mrs. Tolliver who gave it to her at last, in a low voice, as though speaking it too loudly might call something back. Ginevra. The late Duchess had been called Ginevra. She had been young, and by every account gentle, and she had died slowly over the better part of a year, wasting from a sickness that no physician in 3 counties had been able to put a name to. And the county, upon no evidence at all beyond a grim house and a grimmer husband, had quietly decided among themselves that the Duke of Blackmere had helped his wife into her grave. There was, besides the ghosts, a dog. She was an old spaniel, liver and white, and going gray about the muzzle, and she haunted the threshold of the sealed wing, lying pressed against its locked door for hours together. She had belonged to Ginevra. She had waited at that door for 2 full years, and she would let no living soul come near her. Not Greaves, not Mrs. Tolliver, not the kitchen girls who left out food she never touched. Her name, they told Bryony, was Bramble. On Bryony's 3rd morning at Blackmere, the old dog rose and followed her down the gallery. On the 4th, without warning or ceremony, she laid her gray muzzle in Bryony's lap and let out a long, shuddering sigh, as though at last setting down a burden she had carried far too long and far too alone. Mrs. Bea. Tolliver, watching from the doorway, pressed her apron hard against her mouth and hurried away without a word. Bryony did not know what she had done to earn such a thing. She knew only that something in the vast cold house seemed to unclench very slightly on the morning the old dog chose her. And then there was the glass garden. It stood at the very foot of the walled grounds, the great clouded conservatory she had first glimpsed from the carriage, and it was kept locked. Bryony, being what she was, had never in her life been able to walk past a garden without wishing herself inside it, and this one drew her more than any garden had before. For through its dim and streaming panes she could see, even in the black dead heart of winter, a living green that had no earthly business being alive. She pressed close against the cold glass one gray afternoon and cupped her hands to see. Within, amid the green, she could make out pale flowers, low and nodding and faintly luminous in the gloom, blooming freely, as though they had never once been told that it was winter. She knew them at a glance, hellebores. The winter rose, her father had always called them, the flower that opens in the killing frost when everything else has died back into the cold ground, beautiful, hardy beyond all reason. And in the wrong hands and the wrong measure, among the most patient and quiet poisons that any still garden could be made to grow. She stood a long time before that locked and blooming glass, and a slow, cold thought began to turn over in her mind. She went to Greaves and she asked him plainly for the key. His weathered face closed like a door swinging shut. "That was Her Grace's garden," he said, "the late Her Grace. It is not opened, and it has not been opened, and I would not be the one to open it." And he would say no more upon the matter, however she pressed. And her husband's cousin, by contrast, could not seem to say enough. Lysander Fell kept his own rooms at Blackmere, and had the free run of the house, and had had both, she gathered, since well before Ginevra died. He was everything the Duke was not. He was fair where Corin was dark, easy where Corin was hard, and warm and quick and endlessly, tirelessly kind. He was kind to Bryony most of all. He was so very glad, he told her again and again, that dear Corin had found himself a companion at the last. He was so deeply relieved the poor suffering man would not have to die alone in this cold place. He brought her small offerings, a book of pressed and named flowers, a dish of hothouse grapes from some friend's warmer county, and he sat with her through the long gray mornings and made her laugh against her own better judgment. And always gently, so very gently, he would ask her how she found her husband's health that day. Bryony had spent her whole life among people who wanted things. And for the life of her, she could not yet say what it was that Lysander Fell wanted. But she was as certain as she was of assent. She could not quite yet name that he wanted something, and wanted it badly. No man claps at his own disinheriting, and then brings the cause of it, grapes the very next morning, unless he is a man with private reasons of his own, kept well out of the light. She saw her husband only seldom in those first weeks. And each time she saw him he was worse. She began, without ever deciding, to keep a private account of him, in the same careful hand with which she had once kept a household's books. She noted that he was strongest in the early hours of the morning, and failed steadily as each day wore on toward night. She noted that he ate almost nothing at all, and yet strangely was at his very worst upon the days he dined formally at his own table, rather than taking dry bread and water alone in his study. She noted the faint gray, creeping into the healthy pink of his gums. She noted the way his hands would shake far worse on some days than on others, with no labor or exertion anywhere to account for the difference. She noted the cramping he tried so hard to hide from her, and the slow, patient, terrible wasting of a man who was somehow not being permitted to mend. Grief, the physicians all said, a melancholy of the blood, a weak and broken heart. But Bryony had read every herbal her father had ever owned, and a good many more he had not. She had sat up through the last long nights, with the dying and the poisoned of 3 separate parishes. And on the 9th night, standing in the cold gallery outside her husband's study, with a guttering candle cupped in her hand, watching the thin gray line of light beneath his door, she allowed herself at last to think the thought she had been circling for days. It was a thought that lifted the hair upon her arms and set the small flame trembling in her steady, steady hand. This was not grief. Grief did not gather gray at the gums. Grief did not rise and fall with the setting of a formal table. She had seen this shape before in her father's books and in her parishes, and it had a name, and the name was not melancholy, and it was not a broken heart. Someone was poisoning the Duke of Blackmere, slowly, patiently, and by the ruin they had already made of him for a very long time. And 2 winters passed in this same cold and clock-stopped house. A young duchess named Ginevra had died slowly of a wasting that no doctor had ever been able to name. Bryony did not sleep that night. She sat instead at the small writing table in her cold east chamber, with Bramble a warm weight across her feet, and she did what she had always done when the world turned dangerous beneath her. She made a list. She wrote nothing down, for a written thing can be found. She set it out, instead, in her mind, each fact in its column. He was strongest at dawn on the days he took only bread and water. He was worst after he had dined in state at his own long table, and a garden full of the winter rose, patience itself made into poison, stood locked at the foot of his own grounds. She set the 3 facts side by side in the dark, until the whole grim shape of it stood plain before her. Whatever was killing the Duke of Blackmere was reaching him at his own table, and a storehouse of the means stood behind glass, not 200 yards from where he slept. She began the very next morning, like a woman who had spent her whole life making herself useful before anyone asked. She went to Mrs. Antle, Tolliver, and said, with the flat and pleasant authority of a duchess, that his grace would henceforth take every morsel and every drop from her own still-room by her own hand, and that nothing, not a crust nor a cup, was to come to him by any other road. The old housekeeper looked at her a long moment. Then her chin trembled, and she said, "Only, yes, your grace, and God keep you," and turned quickly away, but not before Bryony had seen the sudden shine in her eyes. The key to the glass house she found where the old dog had been keeping watch over it for 2 long years. Bramble had never once willingly left the threshold of the sealed wing, and Bryony had not understood why, until the morning she followed the gray-muzzled spaniel through the one door in all the house that no one would open. Greaves had given her the key to that wing without a single word, and with something like relief in his tired face, as though he had waited a long time for someone brave or foolish enough to ask. Ginevra's rooms lay beyond, shrouded and silent, the furniture sheeted in white holland like drifts of snow. And there, in a little writing desk beneath the window, pressed flat beneath a single faded winter rose, Bryony found the late Duchess's own garden book, and folded within its pages the heavy iron key to the conservatory. The glass house, when at last she let herself inside, was warm and green, and softly breathing, kept alive through the dead of winter by a careful clockwork of flues and pipes. It was beautiful, and it was wrong. For among the banked and nodding hellebores, in the dim far corner where no casual eye would fall, she found what she had both feared and hoped to find. Beds disturbed. Stems cut clean and cut recently. Whole plants taken down to the root, again and again, across what her practiced eye read as a long stretch of seasons. Someone had been coming here freely, to a garden the entire household believed sealed and forbidden, and harvesting from it with terrible patience, for 2 winters and more. She said nothing to a living soul. She simply kept her husband's table, and she watched and she waited, and Corin Fell began to mend. It was slow at the first, so slow she half feared she had dreamed both poison and cure. But by the close of the first week, the gray had begun to lift from his face like a tide going out. By the close of the second, he ate a whole plate of her plain cooking and asked, almost in wonder, for more. the tremor in his hands grew quiet. One morning he walked the entire length of the long gallery without once putting out a hand to the wall, and stopped at the end of it, and stood a while regarding his own two steady hands as though they belonged to some other man. He came to her still room that evening. He had never come to her before. He stood in the low doorway filling it, and watched her grind something to powder by the light of a single candle, and for a long while he did not speak at all. "You have done something to me, madam," he said at last, and his voice was rough. "I had made my peace with dying. I had the whole of it arranged, down to the hymn, and you have gone and undone all my careful work, without so much as asking my leave." Bryony set down her pestle. "Are you angry with me? I do not know what I am." And she saw, to her great astonishment, that the overbright eyes were wet. "I had forgotten how it feels to wake in the gray of the morning and not taste my own grave at the back of my throat." He looked at her as though she were a sum that would not come right. "Who are you that you walk into a cursed house on the worst day of your life and set your hand to the one wheel no one else could even see was turning?" "I am your wife," said Bryony simply. "You did say you wished for one who was clever." Something broke open across his grim face, then slow and stiff and long unused, and she understood that she was watching the Duke of Blackmere smile. Truly smile, perhaps, for the first time in 2 hard years. It remade him from the bones outward. It was, she thought, with a small private alarm, a very dangerous thing to have been shown. But late that night, lying awake with the old dog against her feet, the cold thought came stealing back, and would not be sent away. She had stopped it. She had taken the turning wheel in her 2 hands and held it still. And a poisoner who had worked in silence so long would not be slow to notice that his dying man had begun to live. She held a key to Ginevra's garden now. But someone else had walked freely through that locked glass for years. Someone beneath this very roof carried a key to a garden that even Greaves would not open. And by morning, that someone would know the new Duchess had found the one door in all of Blackmere that truly mattered. For a little while, Blackmere was almost warm. Her husband mended, and as he mended, the great cold house seemed to mend around him. Greaves walked lighter. Mrs. Tolliver hummed over her linens. Bramble left the door of the sealed wing at last, and took to lying across the hearth in the study, where Corinne now spent his stronger evenings, and where he had begun, haltingly, as though relearning a foreign tongue, to talk to his wife of things that were neither death nor account books. He asked her one such evening how a gentleman's daughter had come to know the inside of a sick-room better than any physician in 3 counties. So she told him. She told him of her father and the little still-room he had built her before he died, and the years after, when the village learned that the elder Merivale girl would come out in the dead of night for a fevered child or a laboring mother, and ask no fee when no surgeon would stir from his bed without one. She told it plainly, without pity for herself, the way she told everything. And Corinne listened, the way no one had ever listened to her, without once hunting for the advantage in it. And when she had done, he was quiet a while, and then he said only that the county was a great deal stupider than he had ever given it credit for, which from the Duke of Blackmere she was learning to recognize as something very near to tenderness. She caught herself more than once in those bright, brittle days being happy. It frightened her rather more than the poison had. She did not let herself trust it. She had learned, long ago and at some cost, that the world was never so dangerous as in the hour it first seemed kind, and she was right to distrust it. The kindness broke upon a gray afternoon in the shape of a small, neat man in black who arrived unannounced in a hired chaise and presented at the great door a card that named him the confidential agent of Lady Drusilla Merivale. Bryony received him in the long drawing-room, standing with Corin seated at her side, and Greaves by the door. She did not offer the man a chair. A pile offered that. "Your Grace," the little man began, and there was oil in his voice. "I am sent in a spirit of family feeling. Lady Drusilla is, as you may imagine, distraught. Her ward, a gentlewoman of, forgive me, delicate and unsettled mind, ruined in the eyes of the county, vanished from her guardian's protection and married in a single afternoon to, forgive me again, a gentleman of such very grave reputation. Her ladyship fears you have been imposed upon. She wishes only to see you restored to those who know how to care for you. Should you come away quietly, no more need ever be said. Should you not," and here the oil cooled by several degrees, "her ladyship is prepared to lay the whole sad matter before the courts. A hasty marriage, an unsound bride, a husband who has buried one wife already beneath a cloud. It would make, I fear, a most unhappy hearing." The room was very still. Corin had gone quiet in the particular way she had learned to watch for, the stillness of a man deciding how much force a situation required. But this was not his battle, and they both knew it. Bryony looked at the little man in black for a long moment. Then she smiled. "You may carry my aunt 3 answers," she said, "and she may keep them all. The first is that I am not delicate, and I am not unsettled, and the only unsound thing in this whole affair is her hope that anyone still believes her. The second is that I am 25 in a matter of weeks, at which hour her guardianship of my person and my portion ends forever, and she knows it, and it is the whole true cause of her sudden distress. And the third," she let it wait, and watched him lean toward it, "the third is that you are addressing the Duchess of Blackmere, not Miss Merivale, not the ruined girl who walked out of St. Wyston's in the frost with nothing. Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackmere, whose name my aunt will henceforth speak with courtesy, or not at all. You will tell Lady Drusilla that her ward is dead to her, precisely as she once wished aloud that she might be. And you will tell her that if she troubles this house again, she will find that a duchess has courts of her own and lawyers of her own, and a very long memory indeed." The little man opened his mouth, and shut it, and bowed, and went. When the chaise had rattled away down the long drive, Bryony discovered that her hands were perfectly steady, and that some 10 years of held breath had, in that one cold speech, quietly gone out of her. Corin was watching her from his chair with an expression she could not name. "Remind me," he said mildly, "never to give you cause. That should have been the end of it. It was not the end of it. It was, she understood far too late, only the noise at the front of the house that drew every eye while the true danger moved in the dark at the back. The true danger came for her that night. She had gone up alone to the tower, as had become her habit, to look at the sea by moonlight and to think. The stair was old and narrow, and turned upon itself in the black, and she climbed it by touch, one hand upon the cold stone. She was near the top when she heard it. Not a footstep, the absence of one. The particular held silence of a person standing very still in the dark, where no person should have been. Then the hands came out of the blackness and struck her hard between the shoulders. She pitched forward, the world tilted, the stone edge rushed up, and only her trailing hand, flung out by pure instinct, caught the iron rail and held. She hung there over the drop, her arms screaming in its socket, her feet scrabbling at the worn lip of the step, and below her in the dark she heard swift feet going down, unhurried even now, careful even now, and further off, muffled through 2 shut doors. she heard Bramble begin to bark and bark. She did not fall. She dragged herself back onto the stair and sat down hard against the wall and shook, once from head to foot, and then made herself stop, because shaking would not help, and she had never had the luxury of the things that did not help. Corin found her there. He had heard the dog. He came up the black stair with a candle in one hand and his old campaign sword bare in the other, moving faster than a man 3 weeks from his own deathbed had any right to move. And when the light fell across her torn glove and her white face and the long drop at her back, something happened in the face of the Duke of Blackmere that she would think of for a long time after the cold went out of it entirely. What replaced it was not cold at all. It was terror, naked and absolute. The terror of a man who has just felt the ground open beside the one thing he had not known, until that very instant, that he could not afford to lose. He did not ask if she was hurt. He gathered her up off the freezing stone as though she weighed nothing at all, candle and sword and everything, and he carried her down out of the dark, and he did not once let go. He set a watch that night. Crane at her door, Greaves at his own, every lamp in the house burning against the black. And when at last the household was still, Corin drew a hard chair to the foot of her bed and sat down in it upright, and would not be moved. "It was no accident," she said quietly into the dark. "The stair. It was a hand between my shoulders. I felt it." "I know," he said, "which means it was someone still beneath this roof. Someone who dined at your table and smiled and wished us joy. Someone who walked calmly back down that stair afterward and washed his hands and will come down to breakfast in the morning as though he had done nothing at all." "Then he will come down to breakfast," Corin said at last, very low, "and he will find me at the head of the table alive and looking at him, and he will understand that I have seen him, and then he will make a mistake, because frightened men always do." He looked at her across the single candle. "You will not go anywhere alone in this house again, not the tower, not the garden, not the length of a corridor. I have already buried one wife I failed to protect. I find," and here his careful voice caught, just once, and she heard it, "that I have not the smallest intention of burying a second." Bryony lay still in the dark and listened to that, and understood that somewhere in the weeks of plain food and quiet evenings, without either of them ever once naming it, the contract between them had quietly stopped being a contract at all. The blow, when it fell, did not fall upon Bryony at all. It fell upon her husband, and it very nearly finished what 2 long winters had begun. She had guarded his table so well that his enemy could no longer reach him by it. So his enemy found another road, and it came of all disguises, wearing the face of a kindness. A case of old and costly port, sent up to the study with a warm note in a fair and flowing hand, a gift from a devoted cousin to toast the Duke's return to health. Corin, easy, at last in his own house, glad to be a man among men again, poured himself a single glass by the fire one evening while Bryony was 3 floors below in her still room, and he drank it down. She knew the instant she came up the stair. She knew it from the sound he made. He was on the floor of the study when she reached him, folded over himself before the dead fire, gray as tallow, his whole body wrung and shaking, and the beautiful cut-glass decanter stood open and gleaming upon the table above him like a thing well pleased with itself. One look at it, one breath of the sweetish taint beneath the wine, and Bryony understood all of it. This was no patient measure meant to waste a man across years. This was the end. This was meant to kill him before the sun came up. What followed was the longest night of Bryony Merivale's life. She did not weep, and she did not call for help she could not trust, and she did not once permit herself to feel the fear that stood the whole night at her shoulder. She worked. She had sat up with the poison before in 3 parishes, across 10 hard years, and everything those bitter nights had taught her she brought to bear now upon the one life she was not willing to lose. She fought for him through the black hours with every plain and stubborn skill she owned, and she gave him no pity, for pity was a thing for people with time to spare, and they had none. She gave him instead her whole cold competence, and her 2 steady hands, and her flat, absolute refusal to let him go. The hours went by uncounted, for every clock in the house stood stopped but one, and that one was 3 floors down. She marked the night instead by him, by the gray stretch when she believed she had lost him and would not permit it, by the moment, somewhere past the deep turn of the dark, when the tide of it began at last, grudgingly, to ebb, and all the while Bramble lay pressed hard against the small of her back, warm and silent and steady, as though the old dog knew this work of old, as though she had kept a vigil like it once before in this same house, over another bright life going out, and had sworn never again to lie quiet while it happened. Bryony was glad past speaking of the warmth of her. She did not let herself think too long on how the dog had come to know this work so well. Somewhere in the deepest trough of the night, when the worst of it had broken, and he lay spent and hollow against the pillows she had dragged down onto the floor for him, he began, in a cracked and wandering voice, to talk. "I watched her die," he said. He was not wholly with her. His eyes were fixed on some middle distance 2 years deep. "Ginevra. I sat beside her a whole year, and watched her go out like a lamp with no oil left in it. And there was not one single thing I could do, and I never knew why. The doctors never knew why. And when she was in the ground, the county decided that I knew very well why, that I had done it, that a man with a face like mine, and a house like this one, must surely have wanted his gentle wife dead." A dreadful sound came out of him that was almost a laugh. "Do you know? I half believed them. I thought if I could not save her, if I could not even see the thing that killed her, then perhaps I had done it after all, by some blindness that was its own kind of sin. I have worn that for 2 years. I stopped every clock in this house, so that I need not hear the time she was no longer in it, going by. They think me a monster," he whispered. "Perhaps I let them. It was easier to be hated for a murder than pitied for a failure, easier than letting them know I sat at my own wife's side for a year, and never once saw that she was being murdered beneath my hands." Bryony sat very still in the candlelight, his cold hand held between her 2 warm ones, and she felt the last piece of the whole terrible clockwork drop at last into its place. "Corin," she said, "listen to me, for I am about to give you back 2 years of your life. You did not kill her. You could not have saved her, and it was no sin of yours that you could not, because what took Ginevra was never a sickness at all. She died of exactly the thing that nearly took you tonight, the same hand, the same patient poison, out of the same locked garden. You did not watch your wife die of grief, my love. You watched her be murdered. And so very nearly did I." He turned his head upon the pillow and looked at her, and she watched 2 years of guilt and shame and self-loathing break apart behind his eyes like river ice going out in a spring thaw. He did not speak. He could not. But he lifted her hand, that steady, ink-stained, healing hand, and he pressed his mouth against the back of it and held it there, and she felt the wet of his tears fall against her knuckles, and neither of them said anything at all for a long, long time. By the gray of the dawn he was sleeping. Truly sleeping, the deep and honest sleep of a man who would wake. Bryony did not sleep. She sat on in the strengthening light with the decanter of poisoned wine beside her, and she thought, and then she rose and went to find Crane. She had not, it seemed, been the only soul in the house keeping a quiet account. Crane had been the Duke's own watchman for the better part of a year, set to the task before ever Bryony came, for Corin had suspected in some wordless way he could not prove, that his slow dying was no simple will of God. Crane kept a locked box, and in the locked box lay a meticulous dossier, and in the dossier lay ruin. Lord Lysander Fell was drowning in debt, and had been for years, and had borrowed heavily against a dukedom that would not fall to him fast enough to save him. There were receipts. There was the name of a discreet man in the next county, who dealt in a great deal more than honest physic, and a record of what had been bought from him, and when. It was, Crane said quietly, enough to ruin the man, but not upon its own, enough to hang him, for debts and a druggist's ledger proved only that a lord was desperate and kept low company, not that a duchess had been murdered in her bed. He had waited a whole year for the one proof he could never find, the proof that the slow dying in this house was poison, and not a punishment from heaven. And that proof, he said with a small grave nod toward her, the new Duchess had walked in off a frozen road and supplied inside a single month. And then there was one thing more, which Crane, watching her face all the while, laid before her last, and gently it was a letter. The paper was heavy, and cream, and faintly unmistakably scented with violet, and it was sealed with the print of a small swan, and it was written in a hand Bryony had known all her life, for she had grown up beneath it, her aunt's hand. Drusilla's hand. It was addressed to Lord Lysander Fell, and thanked him, in Drusilla's dry and elegant venom, for his part in a shared and delicate arrangement. It spoke of the elder Merivale girl, made conveniently ruined and unbelievable, and delivered where a friend had need of a bride he would not keep for long. It spoke of a debt between them, to be counted settled once the girl was settled with him. Bryony stood in the cold light of the morning with the letter trembling in her steady hand, and understood, at last and entire, that she had never once been rescued. She had been delivered. Ruined by her aunt, and handed to a supposed murderer, not to spare her the first trap, but to spend her in the second. Her wedding day, her disgrace, her sunset marriage to a dying stranger, it had all been one machine, built by two clever hands in the dark. And both of those hands now knew, past any possible doubt, that the disposable bride had turned in their grip and become a blade. Crane cleared his throat. "There is a further matter, Your Grace," he said quietly. A rider came in before dawn. Lady Drusilla Merivale's traveling carriage was seen upon the coast road in the night, making for Blackmere. She will be at our gates, I should judge, by noon. Lady Drusilla Merivale swept into the great hall of Blackmere at 1:15, in sable and cold diamonds, with all the confidence of a woman arriving to inspect her winnings. She had brought Cressida with her. Bryony's sister came a pace behind, pale and thin and flinching from the dark stone walls, and she would not lift her eyes from the floor, and the sight of her put a small unexpected ache beneath Bryony's ribs that she set carefully aside for later. Lysander Fell was already there, of course, come down all smiles and warmth to greet his dear friend's aunt, and for one long moment the two conspirators stood together beneath the cold hall lamps, easy and elegant and wholly certain of themselves, and did not yet understand that they had walked, the pair of them. For Bryony had spent the morning setting her stage, and she had learned the art of it, cruelly, from the very best. She had risen before the dawn. She had sent Crane hard down the coast road to wake a magistrate and lay certain papers before him, so that the law would already be standing in the wings before ever the players took the boards. She had placed her husband alive, and rested and terrible, in the tall chair by the fire, with its high back half turned to the door, where a man crossing the hall would not see him until he chose to be seen. She had set Greaves at one door, and the magistrate's men behind another. And then she had put on her plainest grey, and gone down to wait, and had found, standing in the cold hall listening for the wheels, that her hands did not shake at all. "Aunt," she said now, coming forward, "and Lysander, do sit, both of you. There is a great deal to discuss, and I should not like either of you to fall down before we have finished." Something in her voice reached them. The smiles held, but the eyes above the smiles sharpened. And then Corinfell rose from the tall chair by the fire, where he had been sitting silent and unseen, and turned to face the room, and every particle of color drained out of Lysander's handsome face. For the man his cousin had come all this way to bury was standing upright and clear-eyed and steady upon his feet, alive, and looking directly at him. "Cousin," said Corin softly, "you sent me such a very fine wine." What followed, Bryony conducted the way she had once balanced a corrupt ledger, laying each proof upon the last until the sum could no longer be denied. Crane brought in the locked box. The debts came first, spread upon the long table for every eye to see, a young lord bleeding money into the sand for years on end, borrowing against a dukedom that would not fall to him quickly enough. Then the name of the discreet man in the next county, who sold a great deal more than physic, and the record of exactly what had been bought from him and when. Then Ginevra's own garden book, and the hidden key that had lain folded within it, and Bryony's plain, unhurried testimony of the harvested beds behind the sealed glass, cut and cut again across 2 winters by a hand that carried a key no honest soul in the house possessed. With every paper she laid down, she watched the two of them change. Lysander's easy warmth curdled first second by second into the fixed glassy smile of a man watching a floor open beneath his feet and finding nowhere left to step. Drusilla held longer, as Drusilla always held, her chin high and her diamonds cold, waiting for the flaw in it, the one loose thread she might pull to bring the whole accusation down around her niece's ears. She did not find it. There was no flaw. Bryony had checked the sum 3 times over, the way her father had taught her, before ever she let a living soul into that room. "You poisoned her," Corin said, and his voice never once rose, and that was the terrible thing about it. "Ginevra, you began with my wife, because a young wife might one day give me a son, and a son would put you forever out of your inheritance. You took a whole year over her, so that no man should ever be able to call it murder. And when she was cold in the ground, you began the very same slow work upon me, and you sat at my table for 2 years, and wished me sound sleep. And when at last I married again, and my new wife proved clever enough to close the road you had been using, you lost your nerve, and you grew impatient, and you sent me a case of port with your own kind note tied to its neck. That, cousin, was your single mistake. A patient man does not sign his poison." Lysander's charm fell away all at once, then, like a mask cut loose from its strings, and the thing that stood beneath it was small and cold. "You can prove none of it," he said. "A garden, a ledger, the ravings of a ruined woman you dragged up out of a scandal. I can prove all of it," said Bryony. "But you have just spared me the trouble of the last piece yourself." She lifted the violet-scented letter into the light. "For there is one thing here you cannot explain away, and it is not yours at all. It is my aunt's. Well, written in her own hand, sealed with her own swan, thanking you for delivering me to you, ruined so that you might have a bride you would not be obliged to keep for long. The two of you built one machine between you. Her half of it ruined me. Your half was meant to bury me. And here it stands in her own elegant venom, beneath her own seal. Drusilla moved for the letter. She was fast, and she had never in her life lacked nerve, but Greaves was faster and stepped between, and she stopped and stood there in her sable with her whole clever face at last coming apart, and for the first time in Bryony's memory, Lady Drusilla Merivale had nothing whatever to say. It was Lysander who broke in the end. Cornered men do. He saw the magistrate's men come in through the far door, summoned before dawn, and waiting all this while upon Crane's word, and he understood in one flat instant that the game was not merely lost, but already over, and he did the one thing left to a man of his kind. He lunged. Not for the door, but for Bryony, for the letter in her hand, with all the sudden desperation of a creature that would rather smash the board than lose the match. He did not reach her. Corin fell, 3 weeks from his own grave, and a great deal stronger than any soul in that hall had reckoned upon, caught his cousin bodily across the chest, and bore him down onto the cold flags, and held him there, pinned and thrashing, and finally uselessly still, until the magistrate's men came and lifted the weight of him away. It was over between one breath and the next. Bryony had not moved. She stood with the letter still in her hand and watched them carry the poisoner of 2 duchesses out into the grey daylight in irons, and felt the great slow wheel that had ground through the whole of her life come, at long last, to a stop. They took Drusilla too. Her bargain with a murderer lay upon the table in her own violet hand, and no title and no sable could talk her past it, and she went out white and silent and suddenly old, and did not once look at the niece she had sold. Only Cressida remained small and forgotten, in the vast emptied hall, weeping without a sound. She had been a weapon in another woman's hand, Bryony understood, as much as ever she had been a willing one, a frightened girl bent to a cruel purpose by the same grip that had crushed them both. And Bryony crossed the cold floor to her ruined sister, and stood before her a moment, and then reached out and took her trembling hand. The poison stopped, and Corin Fell did not die. That was the marvel none of the physicians who had bled him and buried him in their minds could account for. He had never been dying of any sickness at all. He had been dying of a hand, and when the hand was struck away and carried off in irons, the dying simply stopped, like a clock whose weight has at last been lifted. The color came back into him over the following weeks, and the flesh onto his frame. The stillness of a man rationing out his final strength became, instead, the quiet of a man who had many years before him and meant to use them. And with his enemy gone, and her aunt disgraced, and her name at last entirely her own, Bryony came to understand that she was free. The thought arrived one bright cold morning, plain and startling. The whole purpose of the contract was undone. There was no cousin now to be barred from any inheritance, no danger left to stand between. Her settlement was signed, and beyond any reach on earth. She was 25 within the week, a duchess in her own right, wealthy and vindicated, and wholly unbound. She had married a stranger to escape a cage. She need not stay married to a stranger now. She was turning that cold, clear thought over in her hands when Corin came to find her in the still-room, and she saw at once that he had been turning the very same thought over in his own. Kier. "I have had the settlement looked at again," he said. He stood in the doorway as he had that first evening, but he did not fill it the same way now. There was something almost uncertain in him. It holds whether you stay or whether you go. You know that. It was your own condition. I have added to it a house, if you should wish one anywhere you please, and the income to keep it well, and my name upon nothing that would ever oblige you to see this coast again." He paused. "The door is open, Bryony. It has stood unlocked since the morning they took him away. I will not be one more person in your life who kept you somewhere you did not choose to be. If you wish to go, you have only to go, and go free." She looked at him standing there, offering her, of all things, the one thing no one had ever thought to offer her before. Not a chair, not a roof, not a wage. The open door, and no hand at all upon her back. "You are a very strange man," she said slowly, "to spend a fortune barring one door against your cousin, and then throw the other wide open for your wife." "You are not a thing to be barred anywhere," he said. "I learned that, I think, on a tower stair, in the worst moment of my life. When I believed the ground had opened and taken you, I did not think of the estate, or the villages, or the name. I thought only that I had found at the very end of everything the one person I would have chosen above all others, and had never once found the courage to tell so." He drew a breath. "I am telling you so now. And then I am opening the door. Both, in that order, because you deserve to hear the first without feeling the second closing at your back." Bryony set down her pestle for the second time in her life, on his account. "When I walked out of that church in the frost," she said, "with 300 people watching me fall, I swore to myself I would never again stand where I had not chosen to stand. I meant it then. I mean it still." She crossed the small warm room to him. "And I am telling you, Corin Fell, that I have looked at your open door, very carefully, in my own cold way, and I find that I do not wish to walk through it. Not because I cannot. Because I have chosen, freely, and for the first time in the whole of my life, with no one's hand upon me at all, to stay." He reached for her then slowly, as though she might yet change her mind, and she closed the last of the distance herself, because she was done, now and forever, with waiting to be reached. They opened the glass garden together that afternoon. They threw its doors wide to the winter air, and they cut down and burned the poisoned corner of it, root and stem, and every last patient measure of it. And in the cleared and turned ground, Bryony knelt in her ruined skirts, and began, with her own 2 hands, to plant the garden new, not with the winter rose. She had seen enough of what that could be made to do. She planted instead the plain and stubborn healing things she loved, the ones that asked for nothing and gave back quietly, and Corin knelt in the cold beside her and got soil to the elbows of his fine coat, and did not care. "You have soil upon your face, your grace," Bryony told him. "I am a duke," said Corin, unrepentant, and pressed a deliberate streak of it across her cheek with one blackened thumb. "I may have soil on my face in my own garden if I wish it." And Bryony Merivale, who had not laughed freely in the whole of her careful life, put back her head in the cold, bright afternoon and laughed until the old dog thumped her tail against the flagstones, and the gulls rose startled from the wall. Spring came late to that hard coast, but it came. The frost let go of the moor, the sea softened from iron to a living blue, and Blackmere, which had held its breath for 2 long winters, breathed out at last. Corin wound the clocks with his own hand, every one, until the house ticked and chimed with running time again. The crape came down off the mirrors. The sealed wing was opened and aired and let full of light, and Ginevra's rooms became an ordinary part of a living house again, which was the only way left to honor her. Lord Lysander Fell was tried for the murder of one Duchess and the attempted murder of another, and he did not escape it. Lady Drusilla Merivale, exposed in her own violet-scented hand, found her debts called in and every door shut against her, and went into an obscurity from which she never troubled Bryony again. Cressida did not go with her. Osric Vane, finding that the fortune he had married no longer existed, had abandoned her without ceremony, and she came to Blackmere, sorry and alone, where the sea air and her sister's slow forgiveness did their quiet work, and in time she found her feet, unpurchased by anyone. As for the county that had gathered in furs to watch a Merivale girl fall, it did what such places always do. It changed its story. The ruined spinster became the clever Duchess who had saved her lord and cleared his name, and the tongues that had wagged at her disgrace now praised her. Bryony cared for that verdict as little as she had the first. She woke one morning near the end of April in the gray hour before dawn, and went to the window and watched the light come up red and gold over the sea, exactly as it had gone down on the evening she was married. She thought of the girl who had walked out of St. Wistan's alone, in the frost, 4 miles in thin slippers, with no future and no tears to give it. And she found that she would not have undone a single step of the road that had carried her here. Behind her, Corin stirred, and reached across the empty place where she had been, and found it cold. "Come back," he said, still half in sleep. "The sun is not even up." "It is coming up," she said, watching it. "I have never much cared to miss it." She heard him rise and cross the room, and his arms came around her warm and certain, and they stood together and watched the day break red across the water. She had been sent into the dark to be broken. She had walked out of it in her own time and on her own 2 feet, and made of it a morning. If Bryony's road from that frozen altar to the sunrise held you to the end, you already understand why these stories are worth the telling. There is nothing quite like watching a quiet, clever woman refuse to break and turn the trap laid for her into the making of all she becomes. If you love this tale of a wronged bride and a wrongly accused duke, press the like button to help this channel grow, and share it with someone who loves a sharp heroine and a hero worth saving. Subscribe and ring the bell so the next story finds you when it is ready. And tell me your favorite moment below.